Welcome everybody to our virtual book launch for our upcoming Bearden book that we have been so excited about finally getting. As some of you may know, we were supposed to have it back in April, so we have been anxiously awaiting this. We have it up online right now as a pre-order. We should have them in hand tomorrow. Fingers crossed that nothing crazy happens. But yes, so they are up as a pre-order, and as an incentive this evening, since this is our book launch, if you order tonight, you will get a signed copy, and your name will be entered into a drawing for a KHP gift pack, which we will mail to you. I will contact the person via email, whoever wins, and that will be something a little extra for you. So definitely order tonight, and we will be, if in hand tomorrow, we will be mailing them out first thing Monday morning. So,
well, thanks everybody for coming out. This is a treat for me, just because it means we're finally done with this book. We've been working on it for almost 3 years. And I guess this is not, usually at a book launch you have books in hand to sell after the speaker, but we will have them tomorrow. So consider this a preview, and we're going to be talking about a lot of things in the book, which I think will make it interesting to you at least. I want to go into a little bit of the background on the book. When we first founded the Knoxville History Project just over 5 years ago, one of the first things, requests that I got was that why isn't there a book about Bearden? People have seen books about Fountain City, books about East Knoxville, Old Park City. I think there's a book about Island Home and a few even smaller places around town. But there's never been a book about Bearden, which is a place with a very deep history, a multifaceted, complicated history. But we began looking into this and thinking, why not? And even though it is a pretty complicated place in terms of there are a lot of different, completely different, almost but not quite unrelated dynamics going on in Bearden. That make it so interesting. And I don't know why I haven't gone more into it. I've written some articles about Bearden over the years, but I have a deep personal connection to Bearden. All 4 of my grandparents lived in Bearden. I spent a lot of time there as a kid, and I had a paper out on the edge of Bearden, Lions View, and Old Kingston Pike. And a couple of the shopping centers on Kingston Pike were on my paper route. And later on, I was a late night fry cook at Shoney's in Bearden in the 70s. So I got to see that side of it, which is completely different from the way it looks in the daytime. But what the question comes up, and it's come up with every time, almost every time I've said we're doing a book about Bearden, they say, what is Bearden? How do you describe the boundaries of it? It's kind of confusing because Bearden High School kind of leaped out into the distance 40 years ago or so. So it's not really in Bearden anymore. And what is Bearden? Some people have a very strict idea of what Bearden is, and some people have a geographical idea that it's the Fourth Creek, the area drained by Fourth Creek, basically. And a lot of people don't even know what Fourth Creek is. You can just barely see it under Kingston Pike at North Shore. But all this area is drained by Fourth Creek, but that is not historically, that limit is not historically completely valuable in terms of talking about everything that Bearden has been, because in the past, places to the east of Bearden have been called Bearden as well, including the area where West High is, where 100 years ago was called Bearden Field, and that's definitely drained by Third Creek. So there's some interesting aspects here. A lot of people think Carr Street is roughly the dividing line of where old Knoxville is and where Bearden begins, but that guide certainly applied for about 45 years when that was the city limits of Knoxville. from about 1917 to 1962. That was the end of Knoxville. Therefore, everything beyond that was Bearden. But the thing is, before that was annexed to Knoxville in 1917, the area, part of what was annexed was also called Bearden before that. So it's complicated. And when you see some stores opening in Bearden in the 1950s, like the old Parker Brothers, when they opened a store in what had been the Knoxville side of Bearden, they called it their Bearden store. So there's a lot of fuzzy edges to this. We're kind of just accepting the idea of everything that called itself Bearden at one time is Bearden, and that's I just want to get that out of the way to begin with. But I want to say I wrote the narrative for the book and did most of the research. But Paul James, my colleague, has done a great deal of it. He's the co-author of the book because he helped so much with not only with photo research and taking pictures as he has done with other of our projects, but he helped with some of the actual research as well. I've often found myself, even though I know Bearden very well, forgetting something and saying, well, Paul, what was that fact? And he often has the answer quicker than I do. But anyway, Bearden goes way, way back. We're going to show a lot of slides in just a little bit about this, and I think you're going to find something pretty interesting and surprising, and we'll be talking about them. But of course, Bearden has a pre-pictorial history. Bearden began over 200 years ago when settlers began deciding that was that nice valley, this kind of green, fertile valley, drained mostly by Fourth Creek, was a nice place for a farm, or some people thought it was a good place to build a tavern for kind of the stagecoach trade along Kingston Pike. It had legends about it. There was a place at the bottom of Bearden Hill that was known as Murderer's Hollow, because highwaymen 200 and odd years ago would pounce on people as they came around this kind of blind curve at the bottom of Bearden Hill. There are great kind of legendary stories that sound like they come out of the Middle Ages in Europe or something. The story of Jimmy Miller, the prosperous guy who had a fortified residence along Fourth Creek at Kingston Pike, was from Ireland. He did very well, and he supposedly had a lot of people thought he had a lot of money or gold stowed somewhere, and he was suddenly died one day, and it was believed to have been murdered by his two nephews. And I don't know whether this was ever squared away or not, but this is one of the early kind of Grimm's fairy tale type stories of Bearden. But those early days, the story is that there were, even though people lived in Bearden were from all over the place. We found people from Scotland, people from Maryland, other places who moved to and settled in this area. But there were apparently a plurality of Irish people who liked the name Erin, and that was what was called for many years before it was called Bearden. So often you see Erin as the name of this place. But it was not just white people who lived here, and this is one of the things we want, the points we want to emphasize with the book. That by the 1840s, that early, there were free African Americans who were settling in the Bearden area, especially along Lions View, and many of these at the instigation of a guy named William Looney, who had been enslaved. He was emancipated by his owner, and apparently given a boost to buy some property and farm it himself. And I think he did some renting, he did some selling of property over the years, but he owned property along Lions View before the Civil War. This was extraordinarily unusual, obviously, in a slave state. But also, there's something that I never really took very seriously before. I'd often heard stories that there were Cherokee Indians living in this area. That I think a lot of the lore of Sequoia Hills is based on the idea that Cherokee were here, and I always thought that was ridiculous because the Cherokees lived very far away from here, and of course were forcibly removed in the 1830s. So why would there be Cherokees living in the 1840s? But I found a couple of reputable sources that said that there was a small band of Cherokee living right here, selling their handicrafts, baskets, and perhaps fabric creations on Kingston Pike, right near where Western Plaza is today. So in the 1840s and 50s. And at first I thought this is crazy. How can this work? But I began looking into it and found out that there were some stragglers who didn't feel obliged to go along with their fellows to Oklahoma, and actually were not forced out by any government policy at the time. There were just individuals who were agreeing to live as other citizens lived. But anyway, it was, we have what very little we know about this small group of Cherokee who were part of the Bearden story as well. Anyway, the Bearden gets into all sorts of things after that. Of course, it was mostly farmland for a long time. We have some stories about the early farmers. It was the site of one of the first railroad stations in Knoxville in 1855. When the very first railroad arrived in Knoxville, it had just stopped in Bearden. So you could say that Bearden has a railroad history that goes back 10 or 20 minutes before Knoxville's. And later on, it had a good deal of industry, quite an impressive diversity of industry that began with a brickyard later on, and of course it had a mental institution, which we think is one of the reasons that it got its name. But we have a good many pictures. I'm going to ask Paul to show the pictures and also to join in the conversation now and then, because he helped obtain many of these pictures and knows some things about them that I don't. Paul, what is the first slide we have to show? This is a surprising picture of Bearden, I'll have to say. But it shows two of the great institutions of Bearden, one very old and one rather new. This is a picture from the top of, a lot of people wouldn't recognize this as Bearden, but this is a picture from the top of Bearden Hill, looking to the south toward the Smoky Mountains. And on the left in the distance, you see an old building, and that's the old asylum building, the building that was the beginning of Eastern State Mental Hospital from 1886, which is still there, I'm glad to say, as part of Lakeshore Park. But on the right, of course, is the main cathedral for the entirety of East Tennessee, and that's Sacred Heart Cathedral there, which of course was just built about 2 years ago. That's part of Bearden history as well. I guess the holiest place for Catholics of East Tennessee is now part of Bearden and Bearden's history. So we're spanning all these different aspects of Bearden in this book.
Yeah, Jack, if you want to, if anyone wants to go and look at this view, then go up to Bearden Hill and go and stand in front of the Knollwood.
Knollwood, yeah, the old 18.
It's on the north side of Bearden Hill.
1840s.
Yes, this was taken last fall, I guess. I can't remember now. We use Sean Pointer a lot. Sean's a really terrific photographer in town.
Yeah.
Thank you for Sean for working with us on that. So I'll jump in. We've worked with Robin Easter Design again. So it's really designed to be a sister volume or companion volume to the Knoxville Historic Guidebook. So expect 210 full color pages, except where there are black and whites, of course. So Whitney Sanders is a very talented designer. So we're very, I mean, really, this is about a $60,000 project. I mean, when you consider all the hours, hundreds and thousands of hours we put into it, and the printing and the design, it's just goes to show what needs to go into a book of kind of this caliber, which we're very proud of. And ultimately, you, the readers, and will be the judge of it, whether you like it. And but it is a big project, and we thank for all our sponsors. I think I've got a list here. I want to thank Philip Lawson, the Bearden Village Council, and the Pilot Company for sponsoring it. And I know there's a lot of people online tonight that also supported us through individual gifts particularly through our Bearden bundle campaign. So we'll be signing those books and putting them in out with the tea towels and the postcards and getting those bundles out to all of you who supported us end of last year, early this. So thanks so much to everybody who's been part of supporting the project. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Paul. And thought we'd just run through the just to give you a sense of what I was talking about, the diversity and the multifaceted aspect of Bearden. This is what our table of contents looks like. We have we open with the beginning, and this is a kind of the early pioneers, basically. The second is a new institution and a new name. The new institution was the mental institution that was known by various names over the years. Sometimes it's called the Lions View Insane Asylum in the early days. They were less politically correct, but of course later on it was Eastern State Mental Hospital, and later on still Lakeshore, and now is just Lakeshore Park, but is still proud of this heritage. And this was kind of an interesting and progressive idea. We'll talk about it a bit more in a little bit. The debut of the affluent. This was, Bearden was not known as a place for affluent people, basically, but we talk about how that changed, began to change the Bearden area, especially in the very early 20th century, when it had a golf course suddenly and lots of wealthy people who liked living near the golf course. The Dixie Highway was the highway that, it was a national highway that connected the upper Midwest to Florida, basically, and it came right through Bearden. It was designed in 1915, and one of the main routes of the Dixie Highway came down Kingston Pike about 20 miles, and this was the reason we had just suddenly so much tourist traffic and tourist business. All the motor courts and the restaurants and the drive-ins of various sorts that became part of Bearden as we knew it, the Bearden that I grew up with, were as a result of the Dixie Highway period, which began in 1915 and really didn't end until they completed I-40 in the 1960s, and that's when a lot of this began to fade away. Bearden Takes Off is about the aeronautic history of Bearden. This was by very early 1920s. Bearden Field, by various other names, what became our first kind of public airport. It evolved into the first McGee Tyson Airport. It was actually called McGee Tyson Airport by 1929, I believe. Was our first official city airport. But before that, it was a field with lots of coming and going by people in biplanes and barnstormers. Tens of thousands of people would come out to see them. So urbanization, of course, affected all of the city, and of course Bearden, when they were building new subdivisions like Westwood, we have a chapter about how that all happened. The Brickyard. The Brickyard is two things. The Brickyard was a brickyard. It was the first big heavy industry in Bearden that we found out about, dating back to about 1900. But it was also an African American community of people who were associated with that industry, people who lived there because they lived near where their work was, and they worked at the Brickyard, so they had a community that was called Brickyard. And it was still there to some extent until surprisingly recent times. 1980s, I think, was when the last residents left the Brickyard community. We'll be talking about that some later on. But industry in wartime, we're going to be talking about the proliferation of greater industry, from everything from Baum's Florist to the Bowman Hat Company, and the Cherokee Porcelain Company. All these things that came into Bearden using the connection to the railroad, and also just the handiness of other amenities of Bearden to build a nice little compact factory and become significant employers. But post-war Bearden and the drive-in American dream. This is kind of fascinating to me. Now that during the COVID crisis, we're trying to see how much we can drive into places instead of go in. But we were doing it just because it was fun in the 40s and 50s. And we're talking about the kind of the history of drive-ins. The first drive-in theater in Knoxville was in Bearden, and some of the first drive-in restaurants were there. Then one that's kind of surprising is Bearden Bohemia, and we're going to be talking about a lot about the creativity that happened in Bearden. Everything from things that people know about, like the Everly brothers, who lived in the neighborhood, in general vicinity, for a couple of years, and now have a park in Bearden named for them. But also a good many other, a notable marble sculptor, some poets connected to Bearden, including a future poet laureate of the United States had Bearden connections, and as well as a good many other musicians. We'll be talking a bit more about that later on. And then Bearden Reimagined, it brings us into the modern time. This is beginning in the early 1970s, perhaps a bit earlier, when people began looking at Bearden as sort of an interesting, not always upscale, but kind of artsy or progressive, culturally progressive sort of a place. And we're going to be, we kind of tell the story of Bearden as it's become the Bearden we know it today. And I think this is still in action and in process today. All right, next slide, Paul. All right, this is a great old map picture. This is from the well-known 1895 map. And if you've ever been to the McClung collection, you can lose many hours staring at this giant map. It's a map that has more detail on it about the countryside than any map ever made before or since. It even has where individual people lived on it. But here you see Bearden, that little block of 4 blocks. That's how they indicated like urban spaces. And that was like a little downtown Bearden. They're right between Kingston Pike, the black line on the top of the blocks, and the railroad, which is below it. But that was right kind of downtown Bearden, where the business district was. And it shows where the Christian church was, and actually the building is still there today. And a few other things. That Lions View Post Office is there. And down here, of course, it says, and that's where Lakeshore is, Insane Asylum. And that's, of course, what they called it in 1895, without meaning anything derogatory. But that was what how people knew that. But this shows that this was, and you see the big bend in the river there, which we don't always think about when we drive around Knoxville. What a kind of steep hairpin turn of the river takes. They're very picturesque in ways I'll bring up in a minute. But you see a few names like the B.H. Sprankle. That's a name. B.H. Sprankle was an early developer of Bearden, and the same B.H. Sprankle was the guy that built the Sprankle buildings downtown, including the Pembroke, which was originally called the New Sprankle building. So a lot of these, there are a lot of connections between downtown history and Bearden history. But also you see on the left, you see a Miss Weisgarber. It doesn't say what her first name was, but that's where the Weisgarber family lived. And that's where Weisgarber Road is today. But anyway, we can keep talking about this. All these names have relevance in the Bearden story. But next slide. All right, this is that same hairpin turn in the river. We just see one half of it. This is probably the best landscape from the Knoxville area before the Civil War. This is Belle Isle. It's called Belle Isle from Lions View. It's 1859, not 1959.
Oh yeah, sorry, my mistake.
By James Cameron. But James Cameron was a Scottish artist who spent some time here. We don't know exactly how long. There's a new book about James Cameron, by the way, by Fred Moffat, our friend, who is fascinated with bringing out these some previously obscure artists. But James Cameron came here and did some remarkable paintings, including this one. And you can see, I think there are 4 different versions of it. You can see one of them at the KMA today. It's at the very beginning of their Higher Ground exhibit, which is about the history of art in the Knoxville area. But you see some deer in the foreground, and I bet their descendants may be sitting right there today, because there are a lot of people are talking in that area. They're talking about a plague of deer these days. But this is just probably to the west of between Cherokee Country Club and Lakeshore, looking at the river. And this, Lions View was famous for its view, and people would come to Knoxville and stay at a downtown hotel and either take the streetcar or sometimes even walk out this way. We talk about how the poet Wallace Stevens came out to behold the Lion's View, and may have seen something very similar to this. But if you look at this view today, there is still an island. It's not that big anymore. They have to dredging and the TVA work on the river, but there's still an island right there where Belle Isle is. Lakeshore, of course, is to the right of this picture, and you see the Smokies in the background. But,
it's not that much different, really.
Yeah.
Other than a few, houses on the south side,
few
along
houses
Alcoa Highway, rather.
and a few big walls too, unfortunately. But
yeah, a few baseball lamps, I guess, floodlights.
yeah. All right. Well, this is the guy that's all named for, Marcus de Lafayette Bearden, a really remarkable figure. He was mayor for 2 years after the Civil War. He was a former Union officer, was wounded in the war, a wound that may never have healed. And by some accounts, he died of that wound in the 1880s. But he was, this doesn't tell you very much about the fact that when he was mayor, he was also sheriff of Knox County, which is incredible to think about, that you would be mayor of the city and also sheriff. I think he's the only one I know of who had both of those jobs at the same time. But one of the reasons he was well known in Bearden and revered there was that he was a state legislator at the time that they were allocating funding for the mental institution, which Knoxville was very proud of. It was the mental institution when they built it in 1885 was bigger than the University of Tennessee in acreage. It was a big, beautiful place to take care of our mentally ill, including veterans of the Civil War who came home from the war shell-shocked or brain damaged, some of them, and were taken in and taken care of at the old asylum. He died just before it opened, and it may have been the pathos of his sudden death, allegedly from wounds received in the Civil War 20 years earlier, that sparked the renaming of this place, which had been known as Aaron and later Cooper and later Crippen, to be renamed permanently Bearden. That's the guy right there. But a fascinating fellow. He by the way, there are two Marcus de Lafayette Beardens in Knoxville history. The older one was not his father, but his first cousin once removed, I believe, who was a riverboat captain and also the guy that established the paper mill along with Gideon Hazen, the paper mill for which Paper Mill Road is named. So Beardens are all over the place in the Bearden area. All right, next one. All right, here's a great old, this is a postcard, and this shows how proud Knoxville was of the East Tennessee Hospital for the Insane, as they called it. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. Looks like a college, and that's how it looked in the late 1800s. And I'm glad that that's not completely unlike one of those buildings that's still standing. So it's and we still have the trees and the green lawns. So Lakeshore has been a good thing for Knoxville, I think.
Middle part, Jack. Just the middle part is standing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Its large wings were removed. I'm not sure when, but a long time ago, I guess. Also, I have a couple of colleagues, Casey Fox and Charles Jones, who was on the UT Library Society board with me, and I was enjoying going through a UT Library collection. This is a postcard that was scanned in for us, actually. So thank you.
Oh, thanks. Yeah.
And if you've not been lately, you know it's they're doing a lot of improvements over time at Lakeshore Park. It's come a long way. I live in Rocky Hill, not far from it, so I walk it a lot. But they've kind of done a new plaza in front of this, so you could go almost today and see that little section and still see it today, and still have that beautiful view, looking the other way down to the river and the mountains. So here's an aerial view of what it looked like, probably what, in the 20s, 30s, Jack?
Yeah, I would guess so, yeah. Yeah, you can see that that hairpin turn in the background that we saw on the map earlier.
So in the lower left corner, that's that traffic light at Westland Drive coming up to the traffic light and then continuing up the hill to on Lions View Pike with the Veterans Cemetery on your left. These are just a beautiful aerial shots, probably done by the Thompson brothers from the McClung collection. It's just amazing to think all that was there when, and that standpipe, one of those standpipes, well, was taken down not too long ago. And I think the building just left of center, wasn't that a high school um, hospital for black people, Jack, as I recall.
Yeah, you might be right about that. There was a separate dormitory for black patients. But this was, as I say, a very progressive, considered a very progressive institution for its time, and was self-sustaining to some degree. I mean, they had their own power plant. They grew a lot of their own food there at the place. They had a large farm and grew a great deal of the food that they served in the cafeteria there. But had their own. They had a movie night once a week. They had lots of they had dances. They had lots of kind of amenities that we might not think about when we think of a mental institution.
I remember, Jack, a couple of years ago, October of 2018, we held a lunchtime brown bag at Lakeshore, and we couldn't accommodate everybody who wanted to get in the room. And then we followed that with talk at Aaron Presbyterian as well.
That's when we began gathering information for the book, and we met several people who helped us with the book that day that were very valuable to know. All right. Well, this is a game of golf, probably in the 1920s and
21.
Yeah, we talk about golf some in the book. This is Cherokee Country Club's golf course, I guess the oldest 18-hole golf course, and it has its own history, including Bobby Jones, the famous golfer, won one of his first major tournaments at Cherokee Country Club as a teenager, and kind of embarrassed the older guys who'd been playing all their lives. But what makes this picture interesting, and the golfers would find it fascinating, but golf doesn't change all that much over the years. Might be slight corrections in stance and that sort of thing, who knows, but slightly different golf bags. But what makes it interesting is in the background, we see two buildings that are no longer there. They're both remnants of the African-American community of Lions View. On the left is the original Mount Pleasant Church, and on the right is the old Lions View School. It was an African-American public school, and in those days it was for all the African Americans in this part of West Knox County. This was outside of the city at the time, and black people children would walk from the Brickyard down at where Harbor Place is today, walk across the golf course to go to school every day, and I think they got along apparently with the golfers. But we talking about more about Mount Pleasant Church. Both of those buildings were replaced by later buildings that are there today. Even though they're pretty old today, these are previous buildings that were there before those two buildings that are still there on Lions View today. The later Lions View School. Yeah, there's the Mount Pleasant Baptist Church. I think it was built in the 1940s, attractive church of stone. And that was the church that replaced the one we just saw. And beside the church is this really fascinating cemetery that I had driven by probably 1,000 times before I ever got out of a car and looked around in there. And these are there are lots and lots of graves of people black people who lived in the Bearden area. Here we have one of the most interesting couples. Texana and Grundy Crump. They were a husband and wife, lived in Bearden. Grundy Crump was a sergeant in the USC infantry. That's the United States. Let's see,
U.S. colored infantry.
Yeah, well, it was that, but he was. I can't tell if that's a C or a D, but I believe that is USC infantry, but he was wounded in the war. He was held prisoner at one time. But was proud of his war service. Was originally from Middle Tennessee, settled in Knoxville, and was a brickmaker by trade, and began making bricks here in town. Was one of the main brickmakers who helped build the mental institution in 1886. He was around, and his family for several generations retained that connection to Eastern State Mental Institution and worked at the place. it's fascinating to see that. So you see graves like this, like in the National Cemetery, but it's kind of interesting to see them kind of out. I think this is the only actual Civil War grave in that cemetery, but it's an interesting place to walk around.
Hey, Jack, we have a quick question related back to that last photograph about the golf. Nelda Hill. Nelda is asking about Margaret Dixon's father and how he came to be in Knoxville. Is that a little story you can share?
Yeah. Briefly, Jimmy Dixon was a Scottish. Of course, golf is a Scottish game, and the Scottish invented golf, and they were, for many years, were considered the experts on golf. And you weren't a real bona fide golf club unless you had a Scottish golf pro working for you. And in the 19 teens, I think, they found this guy Jimmy Dixon in Scotland and recruited him to come over and help establish Cherokee Country Club's reputation for golf. He was a well-known golfer himself. Was always in the top few every time they had a tournament. But he helped design the first golf course, or I think he helped redesign the golf course after he got here, and was just a familiar and well-beloved figure. It's interesting that Margaret Dixon, who was very prominent in the public library, that I and Nelda both knew personally, lived right within sight of the golf course, just in that kind of modest area just above Old Kingston Pike down there. But an interesting family. I'm glad Nelda asked that. Thanks. But we have a bit about Jimmy Dixon in the book. All right, I talked about the Brickyard earlier. The Brickyard was the Alex Jones Brick Company, which was established in Bearden, fairly close to where what later became known as Knox Plaza, where the Kroger is. But the people who worked there lived just west of there, in what's now the eastern half of Homburg Place area. And this was an entirely African-American community of people who worked at the Brickyard, and they had their own culture. They had, actually, at one time they had 3 different churches in this one little community, and they had picnics, they had dances, they had a dance hall, they had lots of things going on in this community. But this is literally the only thing that's really left of that community, the Wallace Chapel AME Zion Church, which I believe the building dates to the early 1930s, if I'm not mistaken. But it's been there ever since. It was, at one time, it was near some other churches, including a Presbyterian church. But it was right there, and right kind of in the center of this African American community that was there for probably about 80 years or so before they were finally. They weren't forced out, but they were. They changed the zoning so they couldn't sell their land without it becoming commercial. So the last of them left in the 1980s. But quite a number of interesting and prominent people grew up in the Brickyard area. We'll be talking about one in just a little bit, but I interviewed a woman who became one of the first African American television anchors in the Bay Area in California, and another who was a prominent editor in New York as well. People who grew up in this tiny little Brickyard community in Bearden. But this is an interesting picture of the AME Church, and a lot of people might recognize some people in the picture. The Santa Claus in the middle, of course. But on the left, the guy on the far left with the clerical, or I guess the scarf around his neck is Clifford Curry. He began his singing career, I guess, in this church. But of course, he later joined a doo-wop group, one called the Five Pennies, another called the Echoes. They're based in East Knoxville, and later still joined a white rock and roll band, previously white rock and roll band called the Fabulous Five out of Bearden High School. He has a great story. He died a few years ago, but we were able to find an interview with him. He told a great story about going. He loved to go to even though he lived just a 5-minute walk away from Bearden High. He was black, and he was not invited to be a student, of course, but he liked to watch football games there, and he got to know the white kids there, and he met several of these kids who were musicians and wanted to start a rock and roll band, and they did have a band called the Fabulous Five. They invited him to join them as their singer, and they became the Fabulous Six, which I think is the first integrated band I know of in Knoxville history. So that was quite a big deal. They were very popular for a short time in the late 50s, early 60s. Clifford Curry, interestingly, by this time had already had a reputation as a recording artist. He had written and sung lead vocals in a 1956 record called Mr. Moon, which was cut up in New Jersey and got some airplay, especially in the North. But just he came back to his hometown for a while and just joined this rock and roll band. Had some fun with that. Then went back into the recording studio in the 60s and as a soul artist, and he had a few radio hits, especially "She Shot a Hole in My Soul," I guess is his best known recording from 1966 or 7. But a fascinating guy, and a guy that I wish I'd gotten to spend some more time with. But I saw him perform once and met him briefly. But he's part of the Bearden story, and especially that story of him. I love the stories of people, unlikely meetings of people like these white Bearden High kids meeting this talented black singer they'd heard of, and coaxing him to join their group to make some great shows. And they actually cut a few recordings too that you can hear online. He brought kind of an R&B sensibility to their really hard drive and rock and roll. It's cool stuff.
You know, Jack, this doesn't come out in the book, but this photograph tells another story to me, a personal story. But you may see that the photo credit is for Metro Drug Coalition. That's because Metro Drug Coalition has been in the Lions View School, where a lot of these kids lived in the brickyard, walked to school across the golf course.
Yeah.
And you talk about going by the Mount Pleasant Church next door 1,000 times. Well, I've been past the Metro. We've all probably driven by that school and that church thousands of times. And I kept meaning to go in to see if anyone there had any history of that school. And I finally did it after about 6 months of keep missing the opportunity. And when you're doing a book like this, you think that you know where photographs are going to come from, and sometimes they do and sometimes they don't, and then other times things just happen serendipitously. And I think sometimes you have to put the effort in to get the look. But in this case, I think it was Melissa is her name, from memory, said, well, we have a box of stuff, and that's the kind of joy you want to hear, joyful response. So, and also if you ever fancy stopping or end up going to the Lions View School, they do have an interpretive hallway of the history of that school, and it's very nicely done. And they were very generous to share this box with us, and including in it was actually raw footage that the Heartland series crew, presumably Doug Mills, and I don't know if Linda Billman was involved then, maybe at the end of the 90s, Steve Dean, interviewing members of that church, including was about 45-minute raw footage interview of Clifford Curry. So, I mean, it's kind of gold dust really in terms of history, and we made sure we got a copy of that over to Thomas as well. So that's why you'll see sometimes some fairly unusual photo credits. So thanks to everyone at the Metro Drug Coalition for really sharing that history with us.
And we're grateful to everybody that came forward, and Paul's very resourceful about making these connections. And it's been a treat and often a surprise to find out what's out there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Well, this is I'd heard for many years that there was a Lions View streetcar, and if you look at this looks sort of like a streetcar. It has the connections to the electric cables above, but it otherwise looks like a bus with rubber wheels and rubber tires. But this was an interesting kind of a hybrid technology that existed in Knoxville for about 20 years. It was tried. Uh, uh, it was tried about 1930. The stories about there being a streetcar and there being this interesting bus that was sort of like a streetcar are all true, basically. I'd heard that the Lions View streetcar wasn't really a streetcar, but it was originally. When they first introduced the Lions View streetcar, I think it was around 1910 or so, it was an actual streetcar, like any other streetcar in town, like the one that went to Island Home or the one that went to Lincoln Park, on rails, and it went out Lions View and turned around at the mental institution and came back. But in 1930, people were starting to see problems with streetcars. One of the problems was that they could not maneuver. If there was a car that was stalled in front of them, they couldn't maneuver around it because they were stuck on a track. And anybody that's ridden the St. Charles streetcar in New Orleans knows that's sometimes a problem. Sometimes there's something impeding the track and they can't do anything about it until it moves out of the way. And this interesting thing, this electric bus that was connected to streetcar lines above it, was able to steer to some degree around obstacles. And they tried it thinking this might be the future of streetcars. Of course, streetcars died altogether in the late 40s, but in the 1930s and the first half of the 40s at least. And I wonder, there are references to the Lions View car after the regular streetcar service went out of, ceased altogether. I'm wondering whether this ran somehow for another couple of years. But anyway, this was the number 8 line, the Lions View streetcar that people would catch downtown near the courthouse and would ride it all the way out. I think they went through Fort Sanders a little bit and then went out Cumberland Avenue and then Kingston Pike to Lions View. And often if people were riding to UT, they would take the streetcar. By the way, there was kind of a joke about the Lions View streetcar in the 1920s. It was known to attract a lot of eccentrics. There were a lot of odd, interesting stories about the Lions View streetcar because it was partly a rural route. You think nothing's more urban than a streetcar, but Lions View and Bearden was still kind of a rural place in the 1920s and 30s. And the only story about a chicken thief being apprehended on a streetcar is on the Lions View streetcar in the 1920s. I found this guy who had a sack full of chickens, just like in Snuffy Smith, and had made his getaway on an electric streetcar, and they caught him at the next stop, and there he was. But there's another more serious story about a woman named Fannie Lane. We know the story of Rosa Parks in Alabama in the 1950s, but in the 1920s, there was a black woman who was a maid for a West Knoxville family who was riding the streetcar home, and she was tired, and she sat down in one of the front seats, and the driver didn't bother her until someone else on the car said, how can this be? There's a black woman sitting in the front seats of the Lions View streetcar, and the driver said, okay, would you mind moving, please? And she would not move. She did not move, and they actually drove a while until they came to a stop up near on Cumberland Avenue near Fort Sanders, and police got on board and arrested her. I don't think she did much time in jail, but it was an interesting, and she didn't have a big organization behind her like Rosa Parks did, but she did this just the same thing, and was maybe even braver about it because she didn't have any support. But a very spunky lady who saw something wrong and tried to resist it even in the 1920s. We have her story in the book as well. Next one. All right, this is also on Lions View, of course, and this is a great thing. I'm glad they haven't, I admire the fact that they have not painted over this faded historic commercial building on Lions View. And we found the original how it looked many years ago. The L.H. Dalton grocery store was not the first grocery store on this site, but it was the longest lasting. It was, I think, established by the late 1920s. They sold groceries, but they also sold, it was just barely out of city limits. So they sold things like fireworks and things like you couldn't buy in the city. And they had, sometimes even had slot machines and things like that. There are lots of things about Bearden that have to do with being barely over the city limits and things that you can get away with that you couldn't get away with in the city. And I think Mr. Dalton kind of played that fine line. This was still here into the 1950s. And he was one of the first, you see Weedman's Beer, I think he's advertising, one of the early groceries to sell beer after Prohibition. So it was an interesting place. And if you look in the back, you actually see the streetcar. The streetcar used to go around the back of this building. And if you were getting off at the mental institution, you would get off there. But this photograph actually seems to have been taken at the same time the streetcar was rounding the back of the building. All right, next one. All right.
Lions View.
Yeah. This is not far away from that site. This is the Weston Fulton mansion, Westcliff. Weston Fulton was a very interesting guy. He was an inventor. Originally was a meteorologist, I guess, a federal weatherman who worked downtown. But he had an idea that originally to help him with his weather readings. This thing called what he called a sylphon, a flexible metal bellows that he invented. Originally to help him judge the level of the river downtown, and he found out by 1915 he knew that this had multiple applications and that this could be sold in all sorts of industrial uses, and it became useful in the first like depth charges, the first effective weapons against U-boats, German U-boats in World War I. And later on, and the Norden bomb site had a Fulton sylphon in it. In World War II, the famous advantage of the Allies in this extremely accurate bomb site that the bombers had, but also the first automobile air conditioners had the Fulton sylphon in it. So he did very well with this. He built a factory where we now know where University Commons is today. Was where the Fulton factory was. And Fulton lived near the UT campus for a lot of his life, his early professional career, but in the late 1920s, he built this palace, this kind of whimsical palace that people said looked like something in a Douglas Fairbanks silent movie in the late 1920s, and designed by Charles Barber. And I think he had a lot of fun with this too. Up on the ridge above Lions View, and it was there. They lived there for about not quite 20 years. The Fulton family. He died there in 1946, and the Fultons. It was a giant place. His widow didn't want to deal with it, so they sold it. It became interesting. It became a convent for a while for nuns who worked for St. Mary's, and was had a few different roles over the years. It was finally torn down as people couldn't find a practical use for it in 1966, I believe. And I'm glad my dad drove me up there to see it once, just because it was kind of a legend in the neighborhood. You couldn't quite see it very clearly from the road, but it was still there then. But this picture, interestingly, is from a movie called Snow White. It's a live action version of the Disney cartoon with children playing most of the roles. And this picture was taken, a color picture from this color movie. Is one of the few color pictures we have of the Fulton Mansion, and just about a year before Mr. Fulton died. So he might have been in there looking out the window at, what in the world are they doing out there with that white horse? But fascinating history of that place. The old gatehouse to the mansion, built, designed at the same time and built at the same time the mansion was built, it still stands on Lions View, as does part, a little bit of the mansion itself, but not the tower or the things that you see in this picture.
Which is on our driving tour, Jack. The West Knoxville
That's right.
driving.
That's right. Our West Knoxville driving tour. If you want to, if you haven't taken that yet, it's COVID safe. It's completely you can drive our driving tours, and we have the new North Knoxville tour out now on our website. So, but this is on our very first one, was the West Knoxville driving tour. All right, here's another golf shot, and again, as is the case with the first one, we're showing it not because it's an interesting golf shot, and in fact, I'm not even sure exactly what's going on in this picture. It looks like it was probably an important tournament for somebody, but because this is one of the very few, and maybe the only, or one of the very, actually, there's one more we'll show you in a minute, but one of the very few pictures the first picture we saw of the old brickyard, the Alex Scott brick factory, that's in the background there. You see with the big chimney. That's down not far from where Kroger's is, and that was the big industry in Bearden in the first 25 years of the century or so, 20th century. It closed, I believe, in the 20s, but the brickyard community remained there for many years afterwards. But the site later was a place for making concrete blocks, not called Knox blocks, which was.
Well, remember, Jack, we looked at this photograph a long time, because even though it's easy to say it's Scott Brick Factory, but we don't know for a fact.
Yeah.
Until actually after the book was done, well, we thought it was done. This was before COVID, I guess. This was back in February. And I was on McClung online, I don't know, looking for something completely different, and then came across this next image. And it's the same place. And it says Alex Scott Brick Company. So if you can see on the right, you can see the railroad tracks. So thank goodness for Whitney at Robin Easter's. She said, yeah, we could squeeze that in. So we made it in the book even after we thought it was done. So that was kind of amazing to see, because it was not something that was searchable on McClung collection, but the old kind of late 1890s, early 1900s booster brochures, booklets, catalogs, or whatever you want to call them, they were absolutely gems for finding stuff, finding images and finding out what things look like. I mean, it's terrific what was documented, even though it's not necessarily searchable. You do stumble across these things. Like Bob Davis is one of our supporters and viewers, and he gave me a picture yesterday of Camp Poland, and a map of it. We'd never seen that before. So there's some amazing things in the archives waiting to be discovered. Yeah,
you're right, and great find, Paul. I'd been I'd seen the golf course picture, and I couldn't think of any other kind of factory that would have been there, but I wasn't quite ready to say for sure that was the Alex Scott Brick Company until Paul found this picture, and it looks just like the one in the golf course.
But the Clay Borrow pit would have been where Earth Fair was, just closed now, but kind of across the street.
Yeah, the place where they got the red clay for the brick.
Yeah.
And a lot of people, a few people who are over 90 remember the Clay Borrow pit. All right.
Just one image of the airport related story.
Yeah. This is. I wish we had more pictures of the airport. We found just a few pictures of airplanes, but this is a good one though. Frank Andre and Walter Self were two of the leading advocates of aeronautics in the 1920s in Knoxville, and they did most of this at the Bearden Field, which was known by several other names too, but it was basically from Tobler Road all the way to Forest Park, basically was airfield, and it shifted some over the years as there were complaints here and there about airplanes. It's interesting. We went into a story about how a subdivision was trying to be built there, but nobody wanted to build houses at a place where planes regularly crashed. Those early biplanes would would often ditch just off the end of the airfield. So it wasn't until after the airport moved to Blount County that you could develop the area around the airfield. But this was, as I mentioned earlier, in the 1920s, was one of the main 3 airfields in Knoxville. And the other one was at Island Home. It was privately owned. There was another one at Whittle Springs, and I assume that was near where, perhaps on where the golf course is. And sometimes airplanes took off on golf courses. They sometimes landed at Cherokee Country Club's golf course as well. We have a story about that in the book as well. But this was probably the place where most of the public got to know what airplanes look like, what they sound like taking off, and what it's like to ride in an airplane. They would often give rides to people for a couple of dollars, and take you on either on a short trip around the airfield or as far away as the Smoky Mountains. In those days, a lot of the Smoky Mountains was not reachable except by air, or not easily reachable. And they would have tours of the Smoky Mountains. You would drive up, you fly up and see where Elkmont and Cades Cove were, and then drive and then fly back. A good many famous aeronauts came by here, including Jimmy Doolittle came here in the 1920s and did some stunts. And sometimes when there were new, interesting new inventions, aeronautical inventions, like the Ford Trimotor would land here, and some of the early what they call those gyrocopters and things like that would land there as well. But it was an exciting place. Had one tragedy when a well-known aeronaut crashed her plane, and someone a passenger was killed just right at that field. But a lot of stuff happened there. In 1929, this was chosen as the best place for the Knoxville airport, the official Knoxville airport. Knoxville was big enough to have an airport, and the Tyson family made it possible for it to happen. So it was named after McGee Tyson, who'd been killed in the World War I in an air crash. It was there from 1928 to 1937. So it was there. It was the official Knoxville airport for about 9 years, 8 years, I guess, and then moved to Blount County, and that was the end of this roughly 19 year period when our main airfield was down there along the bottom land of really Third Creek on the eastern side of Bearden. But it's a whole story in itself, so it's a whole chapter in the book. One of the interesting things about the book is how many later well-known flyers, pilots, were people who lived very close to this airport, like people like Bruce Holloway, who grew up on Bearden Hill and also on Linas View, but would just come down here every day as a 10-year-old kid watching airplanes take off. He later became a well-known U.S. Air Force, U.S. Army Air Corps fighter pilot in World War II, and later still became a 4-star general in the Air Force and in charge of the Strategic Air Command in the 1960s. So it's you can't overlook the influence of adjacency. There are actually several young men from Keeson Pike who became pilots in World War II. Who had just wandered down here as kids, but that's was one of the interesting confluences of events. Who knows if they would have become pilots if they had lived somewhere besides a place with this exciting airport in the backyard. But back in those days, by the way, it was Mr. Bowers was the guy that began buying up old World War I Jennies and selling them for a couple $100. So you didn't have to have a lot of money to get an airplane and start playing around with it. But the two guys in this picture, Frank Andre on the left was a young pilot and one of the best known pilot, kind of trainers of pilots in Knoxville. And Walter Self was the guy that was kind of in charge of the association that ran the airport. Walter Self was a guy, a mechanically inclined guy who was also associated with the Tennessee Armature, and the Tennessee Armature building is still standing, and now all condos on Jackson Avenue. But that was his job, but this was his love come out here and fly every opportunity he had. But a whole fascinating history that a lot of people, despite the fact that there's been a plaque there for a few years, a lot of people don't know about this at all. But you can see even still with the armory and the high school that this was a flat area and one of the very few places in town that you could land and take off an airplane.
Or put a circus tent up, Jack.
Yeah, that's right. In 1940, yeah, in the 1940s, this was where the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus would come. And we have a sidebar about the circus coming to town and coming to Bearden. The circus came to different places at different times, but in the 40s, it set up in Bearden. The big tops, even with the famous the Flying Walendas and who is that famous clown? All the famous Ringling Brothers people were there in Bearden. We found a good description of one of their shows there.
And the gorilla, what was the gorilla's name? Oh my goodness.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
I know it is gone 7 o'clock. We're going to be mindful of everyone's time, but it just goes to show that you can't talk about Bearden in 5 minutes. There's just so much history.
Yeah.
That we've got into this book, so we'll keep going for a bit. And if we lose you, we're sorry about that. But
yeah, the Dixie Highway. This is looking down Kingston Pike, where I'm not sure if we ever identified for certain where this was. I picture it being near Western Plaza, looking west, but I don't know why I think that. But this is a place called the Dixie Highway Garage, and that was, this is the 1920s, and this was the time when Dixie Highway was the way to get around. If you're going from Chicago to Miami, you might drive right down this street, and it developed a whole economy that had not existed and also before of motor tourism. And including garages, including motels, motor course, tourist camps, restaurants, drive-in, and otherwise. It was a whole new way to look at travel and a way to look at the suburban part of a city. All right, next one.
second.
These pictures.
Actually, we're looking east, Jack, because there's a little sign on the far left is pointing to Highland Cemetery. So we're looking actually east.
Okay, yeah.
Towards downtown, same way as we are here, I think, aren't we?
Yeah. Okay. You were looking east toward downtown. You're right. Yeah, in this picture, definitely. We got these pictures, by the way, from the old Post Sign Company, a venerable old company that was the main signage company in Knoxville for many decades. And we got it through our friend Jody Davis, who found a lot of old photographs that had been made just for business purposes for the Post Sign Company, and then stowed away or forgotten. But we found these, we got these pictures, and they're useful for lots of purposes, even though the purpose of them was just to take pictures of signs. But here we see a few interesting things. We see some signage. I think in this picture you can see some signage pointing to the Highland Cemetery, and the Dixie Highway lofts lots on the left. And interestingly, and we were really pleased to see this picture on the right. You see the Curry family mailbox. This is Clifford Curry's ancestors. I think his grandfather was the first landowner who settled here on Kingston Pike, and it was right where Homburg Place is now. So it was a black family that was there for many years, and well known in the community. I never would have thought we would find an actual photograph of their mailbox, but there it is. But it's
by the way, Jack, on that Dixie Highway lots, it says was it Logan? He was the guy that developed.
That's right. Yeah.
What was the place down on Westland?
He developed lots of. He and his wife Whitty Logan developed parts of Sequoia Hills. They developed Westmoreland.
Westmoreland, that's it.
And they also developed Highland Cemetery, which is kind of like a neighborhood for the dead in a way. but they designed it kind of using the same principles they had applied to Sequoia Hills. We have a bit about the National Guard Armory, which has been there, and it moved in not long at all after McGee-Tyson Airport moved to Blount County. The Armory had been needing a place. It had been a controversy for years. Where was a safe place to put the Armory? An earlier Armory had blown up on UT campus, or on the side of the hill, and we're just lucky nobody was hurt. But it caught on fire, and all this ammunition just went up, and people thought it was a giant fireworks event, but in fact it was an uncontrolled burn of an armory. But they were looking for a place to build a permanent and safe armory, so they found this unused land that had been part of the old Bearden Field Airport. That they built the armory. The buildings you see today were built, I think, in the 1950s, except there are some older buildings, including the one that these soldiers are in on the right, that some people claim date back to the airport era and may have been hangars, and we weren't able to prove or disprove this, so we're staying neutral on that question. We went over and had a look at them. They're interesting old-fashioned concrete block buildings. But we're not sure they go all the way back to the airfield era. By the way, the Armory has played a role in every war since the Second World War. There were people who trained at this Armory who later became heroes in the Second World War, and it was very well regarded at that time. And it served various public purposes over the years, kind of fundraisers and so forth. Also, occasionally musical events. Otis Redding did a show at the Armory in the early 1960s. So it served a lot of different purposes besides just training soldiers. All right, here's a great picture. I'm glad we were able to get. We had to get inside the old Naples building to get this picture, which I had seen before, and I thought I got to see it. We didn't find this anywhere else. It was just hanging on the wall, and we were able to borrow it, and we thank the owner for letting us do that. But the Wayside Inn was what was there before Naples, and this was one of those tourist I don't want to say tourist traps. It was a restaurant, a simple restaurant. In daytime, they advertised country ham, hot biscuits and honey. Sounds very appealing, and steak and chicken dinners. And I thought that's all these years, I thought that's all it was. But when they opened this place in 1926 or so, and we have the whole story about this in the book, this was also a nightclub, and it was sometimes a nightclub that did not even close. It was open all night, and they would have jazz bands playing here, and people from Knoxville would come out here and be able to get away with things that they couldn't do in Knoxville, drinking and gambling and all sorts of things. And some well-known, like the Tennessee Chocolate Drops, played here once. That was really surprising to me in 1930 at the Wayside Inn. These were places, you know, built to appeal to tourists, but because Knoxvillians knew that they were there, they would come out here and sometimes, you know, would spend the whole evening here. They would sometimes serve breakfast to people who were still dancing to jazz, you know, after having been there all night. But this building was burned down in the mid 1940s. And was replaced with the Naples building we see together today. It was that kind of curved stone building, kind of that with that sort of Airstream design that was very popular in the 1940s. But that was just built to replace this this frame building that had been there before that. But it was still called the Wayside Inn for several years before it became Alberti's first, and then later Naples. So next door was another place called the Spanish Garden, which was, I understand, a slightly less reputable place. So it was a fascinating place to be, certainly, whether you're traveling or whether you lived here.
That Spanish Garden, it's still elusive, isn't it, Joe? We never did find a picture of that.
Never found a picture of it. My father remembered going there a few times. He said it was kind of a rough joint.
But we did find an ad for a small, tiny little ad for the Howard Armstrong played at Wayside, didn't we? Am I dreaming that? Right. I think we did. Right.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you to David and Barbara and Myers. I think they're with us tonight for sharing this lovely view, looking, I guess, west up from Lahadi Drugs on Kingston Pike up Bearden Hill.
Yeah, it goes to show that a lot of people don't take pictures unless there's a something extraordinary going on, like a big snow. But this is one of the best pictures of a drugstore that a lot of people remember, Lahadi Drugs. I think they later moved around the corner to North Shore, but this is how they looked in 1940. This is kind of downtown Bearden. All right, this was astonishing to me because I have no memory or even I'd never heard of this place. There was an amusement park in Bearden for maybe 3 years or so. It was called Kittyland, and it was at the corner of Kingston Pike and Forest Park Boulevard, about exactly where Everly Brothers Park is today. In the late 50s, early 60s, that was an amusement park, and they had a little a train that went around. They had lots of little rides that you could take. There were even complaints at the drive-in movie theater next door about the noise from the amusement park, even in the night, that people would be enjoying it. So it was, but they had a swimming pool, public swimming pool, and had lessons and that sort of thing. But lots of odd little attractions. It just didn't last very long. I think it was out by 1961 or so.
But Mayo's, that section of Mayo's looks exactly the same.
Remarkably, Mayo's
60, 70 years on.
Has been there since 1950, and it looks exactly the same today as it does as it did then. That stone front.
I can't remember. This showed up on Facebook. I mean, it's just amazing. Is anyone seeing this dialogue coming across the screen? I don't know what happened to my computer, but anyway, I was saying that this photograph came up on one of the Bearden Face group chats, and was able to track this guy down. I think he lives in California, and he just collects images of Disney World and all kinds of places where tourists would have gone, and he has just about 8 of these photographs, and so we've got a couple in the book, which is wonderful to see.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, and I mentioned industry earlier. One of the most interesting industries was Cherokee porcelain, which was an unusual kind of sort of a specialty, sort of finesse kind of sign company that made signs with actual porcelain applied to metal. And Cherokee porcelain in years to come would be in charge of making all the signs for the New York subway service. But it began there in Bearden in a building that's still standing on Hamburg Drive. But this is what the old that neon sign looked like, and a very stylish sign looked like in the early days. And they were proud of that they had done a lot of the signage for Bearden, including the Kingston Pike Center here, where Long's Drugstore is, of course, today. That particular sign has gone very, very much a 1960 era style. But 1956, I guess, is when they actually built that sign in that shopping center. But they're still in business now in the Forks of the River Industrial Park, and we're lucky that some people, Jennifer Gorham and her friends at the Cherokee Porcelain, there made some of these things available for us.
That building's still there, isn't it, next to Jerry's Adorama?
Yeah, you can see the name.
Has the date on it, doesn't it?
It does, 1946, and has the names of the 2 original partners who invested in Cherokee Porcelain on the front. All right, this is when Bearden started to take on airs. This is the day that Ingrid Berkman got out of her car in Bearden and put her handprint on the sidewalk and signed her name for the world premiere of A Walk in the Spring Rain at the Capri 70. Which was a very big deal for Knoxville, and it was a big deal. Not only it was a celebrity getting out of a car in Bearden, but it's interesting that it was a big deal for Bearden in that this was the first time that there had been something of this scale, of this degree of attention in Knoxville that wasn't downtown. All the previous premieres had been at the Tennessee Theater. But this was kind of an acknowledgement that in the new suburban era, Bearden is kind of the place to go for movie premieres, and that's where they showed the movie at the big Capri 70. The Capri 70, by the way, was an evolution of the old Pike Theater, which had been a theater built in 1946, bigger than an average neighborhood theater, but still kind of something of its era. But it kind of evolved over the years. In the early 60s, it became the Capri 70 and a bigger theater, and our first Cineplex, in terms that it had first 2 and then 4 screens, and I guess 5 screens if you talk about the terrace as well. But so it was kind of a big deal and kind of an artifact of its time, and it showed how things were changing rapidly. But it's interesting, just about the same time that Ingrid Bergman got over a car, the first Mercedes dealership in Knoxville opened a stone's throw away at Knoxville Motor Company. So it was, things were, Bearden, which had never been a fancy place, was getting fancy by 1970.
So if you guys want a fun thing to do on a nice Thursday night, Saturday night, go and find that piece of concrete, and it's right there.
Yeah, that's right.
Just down the road from 50, 100 yards diagonally across from Nostalgia, Jerry's Autorama.
Yeah.
I think there's about 8 or 10 of them.
A few others, yeah. Cliff Robertson and Patricia Neal and a few others have signed it over the years.
It's a little movie walk of fame.
Yeah.
Right in the heart of Bearden, on Homburg Drive.
That's down right before he moved here. So, and that was kind of it's interesting to see.
Okay, I think we're getting towards the end. Courtesy of Bradley Reeves. Well, this is getting to Bohemia now, Joe.
Yeah, I mentioned the Bohemia chapter, and it's too much to get into right now, but there was a recording studio in the Bearden area. Actually, it was at Dean Hill Country Club. Jack Comer, who'd been involved in entertainment since he was a kid, and he was a dancer for the Maynard Baird Jazz Band back in the 1920s, and later ran a pool hall downtown and some other things. But in the 1940s, opened Dean Hill Country Club, and it was a place. It was a great country club with a great golf course, but it was different because he had connections to people in showbiz and lots of well-known people. The Dorsey brothers had their big reunion there in the early 50s, and lots of other interesting folks performed there over the years. But for a while in the 1950s and 60s, he had a recording studio right on the golf course, basically. Pretty quiet place for a recording studio, as long as you don't get hit by a golf ball, I guess. But it was here are 2 kind of emblematic. They cut hundreds of platters there, but the one on the left is "Crying in the Chapel" by Daryl Glenn. This was the first ever recording of this song that was later a big hit for a lot of people, including Elvis Presley. Daryl Glenn's recording was not quite that well known, but it was the first ever recording of this song that his father had written, or I think that's how that went. But then we have an Archie Campbell song. This is Archie Campbell, of course, was a comedian well known for his work on Hee Haw 20 years later, but he was also a singer, and he did some singing for recording at Valley Records at Dean Hill. But a little bit of music recording history. Knoxville's not known for its music recording history, but this is one little footnote, at least, to that.
And also in the book, Jack, we talk about Don Gibson, of course, the Everly Brothers as well, which we talked about before, but they're definitely in there too.
Yeah. Don Gibson lived in and around Bearden for surprisingly many years. I never realized that they weren't necessarily happy years for him, but in the 50s and early to mid 60s, he was there. And
your beloved Cormac McCarthy. That's a big connection.
Right. That's another part. I love the fact that Cormac McCarthy, the novelist, famously reclusive novelist, lived in a motel in Homburg Place area for a couple of years while he was writing Blood Meridian in late 70s, early 80s. And to think about all the things that were going on around there, that just down the road, for example, there was bluegrass at Buddy's Barbecue going on every week, and people like Ricky Skaggs were performing there before he was famous, and just all these interesting little things going on here and there, and it's hard to say they had any connection with each other except that they were proximate in a way. But also, of course, we get into the fact that Knoxville's TV studio era, the cable TV industry began in the Bearden area, and that did have a little bit of connection to the bluegrass thing, because some of the people who performed at Buddy's were people or musicians who played for the early the Senatel stuff, which a lot of which was very musically oriented. But all right, anything else?
I think we have 2 or 3 more. We wanted to mention Johnny Cash and June Carter Cash playing at Lakeshore in '72. Because we couldn't find a picture of it to use in the book, other than this. This is not in the book because we don't have permission to use Sentinel photographs, and that was also a challenge for the book, that the Sentinel charged so much these days for even one photograph that was just too just wasn't open to us. But it is pretty cool to think that Johnny Cash and
June Carter Cash and
Carl Perkins.
Carl Perkins was there too that night. That's right.
Yeah.
Played a special kind of just a free tribute show for the inmates at Eastern State. It's interesting. Johnny Cash was famous for doing prison shows. He did those in the '60s and '70s all over the place. But I think this is the only time he ever did a concert at a mental institution that I know of.
Yeah.
So
we worked with a local artist, Esther Sitver. She just finished college actually down in Ringling College of Art, talking about Ringling Brothers Circus. But she kind of recreated a couple of old grainy photographs like you just saw in the Sentinel. There's Johnny and June Carter playing at Eastern State. So these were a couple of postcards that we also sent into our Bearden Bundle supporters. And then, of course, the one photograph that we never really found was of the Bearden Station. So that, in a way, is still largely elusive. But Esther's a really talented up-and-coming artist. And the last display she had was because Nikki Russler, our board member, introduced us, was at the Arnstein Jewish Community Center on Dean Hill Drive. So there are nice little bright spots in the book. Yeah. Which was one of the kind of the last cool things to kind of find. I met a fellow, I think in early February, that connected with Charlie Baum, and Jack and I went out to see Charlie Baum. Can't remember the ancestry now, but I guess his great grandfather started Baum Nursery back in, I guess, in the late 1800s, right, Jack?
And calling it a nursery, it may not convey what Baum's was. Baum's was one of the biggest rose manufacturers in America. It's amazing, like 6 million roses a year, some kind of amazing thing. And most of it was done right here in Bearden. It was an amazing operation they had for quite a long time until well into the 1960s.
So this is a shot looking. If you look at the far left, so the cool thing about this photograph is that there's a book, and probably a few of you have seen it. There's a copy in McClung, and they're all copies of these photographs. It's a neat book, but they're not actual photographs. You know, it's pictures on paper. But I pretty feel confident that the small little tiny building in the far left, is probably, not definitively, but probably the Bearden Station, because on the far left you can see little visual cues, which is the rail line. So we're looking towards North Shore Drive. On the far right, which is where Sacred Heart is now, the school and the new cathedral. So, and this photograph was in a binder sitting on top of an old rickety bookshelf in Charlie Baum's office on Baum Drive. So it's just amazing that sometimes these photographs come through in the end. So
Bearden had passenger service from the 1850s up until at least the 1920s. And the Bearden Station seemed to vanish in the 1940s, and I think it had been closed to passenger service for some years before that. So it's this is beyond out of the living memory of a lot of people. The Bearden Station. We asked every old person we could find if they remembered either coming or going on the Bearden Station. We couldn't find anybody who had. But we found a few references to it still being a viable station in the 1920s.
I think this is the last one. Working
Right.
again with Bradley Reeves, good friend of ours, who created TAMIS. He's on his own now with his own Appalachian Media Archives, but he had quite a new set of slides. Some fellow that I can't remember why he was taking them now, he's all over Knoxville.
So it's kind of unsettling to see pictures and I start looking for myself in them, but I think I might be in that one somewhere if you look closely. I went to many movies that I probably saw Rocky at Capri 70, and I worked at Shoney's Big Boy, so I knew. It was not a pretty part of Bearden's history, but that it was there nonetheless. All right. Well, thanks for everybody for joining.
Oh, I think actually there's a couple more. We had fun kind of photographing the Quonset huts. Which are several, including the one on the top is right next to the railroad trestle, near where the station used to be. If anyone wants to know where the railroad station used to be, it's kind of, if you're heading west, if you're heading north on North Shore, it'd be on the left behind Pat Bright's Prison Pool.
A little background: Quonset huts were kind of became a thing during World War II. They were a way to quickly put up a useful and durable building in the Army, and this technology right after World War II was trendy and very useful in lots of applications, mostly commercial. And I had always noticed that there were more Quonset hut style buildings in Bearden than in most places, with either barrel roofs on buildings that don't look like Quonset huts or actual Quonset huts here and there. And I began talking to architects about how they were designing some Quonset hut style buildings today in Bearden, and like this one. And they said, yes, they were reflecting that what they'd seen in Bearden, the fact that there were so many Quonset huts being built. I think it was because Bearden was expanding so much, right, in 1945, 1946, when suddenly there was a demand for these commercial buildings all over the place, and it started almost to look like if Bearden had an architectural theme, it would be this barrel roof style. Even the Kaz Walker store has a barrel roof style. It was there for about 20 years, beginning in the 1940s. So this was an interesting thing to notice next time you drive through Bearden, how all the interesting barrel roof styles kind of reflecting this late 40s era when Bearden was rapidly developing.
And there's quite a few down Sutherland Avenue as well. Some of the older buildings, some of them have fronts on. You can't quite tell, but there is a bunch of them in Bearden and that area. Yeah. I think that wraps it up. I do want to say, Nicole, like, tracking everything that everyone spends in a fun way. And we've had our best sales night probably since last Christmas. So thanks to everyone who's ordered a book tonight. We've
thanks. Wow,
taken about $700 already today. So
wow, wonderful. We can retire now.
You.
And I'm going to give it till midnight tonight for the drawing. So if you purchase the book, your name will be in the drawing, and I'll do that first thing tomorrow morning and email the winner.
And who's going to do the drawing, Nicole?
Oh, she's watching cartoons right now.
Yeah.
My 7-year-old will pick the name out of the hat.
All right.
And if you want more copies or you haven't bought it yet, we all have it at Union Avenue Books. Obviously, you can buy it online with us. We'll also have it locally at various places throughout Bearden as well. So if anyone is listening that is connected with a shop in Bearden, whether it sells books or not, we're happy to talk to you about selling it. To connect with the bigger audiences we can. There's just thousands of people out there that would really love to know more about a place they live and shop and play every day. So,
and honestly, it's kind of a capsule history of America in some ways. I think if you lived in Boston, you might find this interesting because it brings in American history at every corner, and it's kind of a universal story in some ways.
Well, we'll plug what we're doing next week, and then if anyone has any questions, next week we are going to kind of do a virtual driving tour. We haven't figured out exactly what we're doing yet, but we have 3 that we go at: the near West Knoxville one, the East Knoxville one, and North. So
Yeah.
look at that for that next week.
We're all virtual all the time these days. So, yeah. But appreciate everybody joining us. Does anybody have any questions or want to talk about anything, or would love to hear from you?
I was wondering if you know how long it would take to get to Bearden in the 1930s.
You mean on the train or?
I guess, yeah, like either from, well, like, yeah, coming from like North Knoxville or East Knoxville.
Honestly, if you had a car, it would take about the same time as it does today, except you don't have an interstate. That's all. And I don't use the interstate anyway, so it's about 15 minutes or so from North Knoxville. But train in the heyday of trains, obviously that's probably even faster than today. It's interesting how many people use the train as almost like a public transportation within Knox County. They would. Bearden was the first stop listed at the train station downtown at the Southern Station. It was just 5 miles away. So people would go to the Southern Station as if they were going to New York or somewhere else and just, take it to Bearden and get off there, which is probably, I mean, in those days, it was, trains would be faster than cars today because they didn't have any traffic. And so that was probably 10 minutes or so.
Dan Charlton asked, is the Legend of Thunder Road the crash mentioned in the book?
Yes, and it's we don't make any definitive judgment about it. It's a plausible story. I'll just say that there are lots of people who claim that that Thunder Road is the story of the bootleggers. Of course, it was a movie with Robert Mitchum, and Robert Mitchum wrote the movie and never told anybody what his inspiration was. And he may have just made it up out of his mind, but the fact when the movie came out, it spawned about a dozen different stories about it was probably really based on this bootlegger or that bootlegger, and this crash or that crash, because the guys, spoiler alert, the guy's killed at the end of the movie, and but there have been wrecks like that in the Bearden area, so we really don't know, but it's plausible. Yeah, great old story, great old movie, and part of the Bearden, deservedly part of the Bearden legend. A lot of people don't know that Thunder Road also is supposed to have inspired Batman in the TV series, and the Batmobile was kind of based on the Thunder Road vehicle that Robert Mitchum drove that had all sorts of devices that would belay pursuers.
I never knew that.
Well, thanks everybody for joining us, and please come back next time. And if you had a question and didn't want to ask it now, just email me or Paul, and we'll do our best to give the answer. We're hoping, Paul and I have not even seen a prototype copy of the books yet, so we're hoping to see that tomorrow, and we'll have them out and to you very soon, assuming we're happy with it. If it's something crazy about it, we'll have to, yeah, we'll see how that happens. But anyway, but we thank you for coming out, and stay in touch, please, all the time. I'm happy to chat with anybody.